Race and racism have become central to modern politics. Nearly every political question, no matter how trivial or benign, is turned into an issue of race. Leftists thrive on non-white identity politics, while conservatives typically avoid the issue. They often claim they are above it all and wish that their political opponents would simply stop racializing political issues. But this is never going to happen. Asking the left to stop playing identity politics is comparable to asking one football team to quit scoring so many touchdowns because it is unfair to their opponents. Identity politics is a winning strategy for the left. This is especially true because the right refuses to play the identity politics game. It has been a one-sided battle for over 50 years now. If you are reading this essay, you are probably a disaffected conservative or libertarian, or maybe even a progressive, who is sick and tired of being beaten over the head with the dreaded R word. Racism is a very complex issue and takes a complex approach to understanding it. What is racism? Most people think that racism is disliking someone simply because he belongs to a different race. But racism is much more complicated than that. To quote a passage from Wilmot Robertson's The Dispossessed Majority. As the idea is to ideology, so the concept of race is to racism. This leads to the definition of racism as a belief in the race idea. But belief implies some measure of assent, some inward or outward activation of the belief. Racism, accordingly, can be described as the overt or covert expression of the concept of race at one or more levels of human activity in politics, art, religion, business, community life, and in the privacy of the home. 1. Perhaps, now you see why the Republican Party is called racist all the time. The GOP is not a white identitarian or white nationalist party. However, it is a party that is almost exclusively made up of white people. The policies the GOP advocates for may not appear to be racist on the surface but are implicitly racist because they are claiming to represent what are seemingly white interests. This is that covert expression of race, and the GOP is very guilty of dog whistling on such issues. That is, talking about welfare queens, illegal immigration, and urban crime. Sadly, the GOP does nothing to actually address these issues. They just talk about them to keep white voters in their ranks. When white people express their self-interest as a group, they are called racists for doing so. When non-whites express their self-interest as a group, they are called heroic. This is a blatant double standard. This racism thing seems to be a one-way street. It only works against white interests. Political correctness, heresy, and the Church of Secular Liberalism. Americans often believe in the misconception that the USA is a free country. This is not entirely true. It is true that people are not being sent to gulags, jailed, or put to death for their speech. However, if one dabbles in thought crime, you might find yourself socially ostracized, out of a job, and unemployable in the future. You don't need the government to stifle speech when corporations, NGOs, universities, Hollywood, and the media are doing a great job of keeping a lid on what is or is not acceptable speech in public discourse. Although, with the rise of the alt-right and the demographic shift taking place in this country, do not be surprised if hate speech laws become a reality within our lifetime. A kind of soft totalitarianism exists within our society, and the policing is mostly done by the elite managerial class. These managers are also the ideological enforcers. They essentially constitute the state. What is the ideology of the elites? Secular liberalism. Liberalism is a belief in things such as democracy, liberty, and equality, especially the equality part. The USA is just as much of an ideological entity as the fascist and communist regimes of the past, minus the hard totalitarianism. In order for a society to be functional, its citizenry must be ideologically aligned with the state. Society would not function very well if half of the electorate were communists and half of the electorate were fascists. Such a society would eventually collapse into civil war. So everyone living under the secular liberal state of the USA must be some kind of a secular liberal, that is, a libertarian, a conservative, or a progressive. While these various factions may bicker about tax rates or government programs, they all agree to the orthodoxy of secular liberalism in their own way, that all human beings are created equal. What if you do not believe that all human beings are created equal? As Rams Powell puts it, in Soviet Russia, you would be called a counter-revolutionary for challenging the state ideology. In Soviet America, you would be called a racist for challenging the state ideology. Enter the alt-right. You may be asking yourself, what is or isn't racist? Lots of things are racist. Using the dreaded nigger word in conversation is racist, and most everyone would agree that is racist. However, talking about the correlation between race and IQ or race and crime is also called racist by the thought police. Why is that? Using a racial slur or citing scientific evidence that race is a biological reality with real social consequences are both racist, because they involve differentiation. You have distinguished between us and them. This implies that there are different groups, and difference is not equality. You have challenged the ruling ideology. You have committed heresy in the Church of Secular Liberalism. Secular liberalism, which includes multiculturalism, egalitarianism, and political correctness, really is a religion because it takes faith to believe in things contrary to evidence. The alt-right is a movement of heretics. Whether we are using offensive language or scientific evidence, we are making our point that there is an us and a them, that race is biologically real. Only white people can be racist. If you have been paying attention to the changes in political discourse over the past decade or so, you may have run across the meme that only white people can be racist. Now, you might think that this statement is racist towards white people, what is also sometimes called reverse racism. Reverse racism is an interesting concept because it implies that normal racism is a sin only committed by white people against other races. So-called anti-racists promote the idea that there is no such thing as reverse racism, or no such thing as racism against whites. They often cite the mantra that racism is power plus prejudice. Since white people are the only people in society with power, they are the only people in society who are racist. Of course, whites do not hold all the power in American society. If we did, do you really think we would advocate an immigration policy that diminishes our power, ultimately to nothing? Worst. White supremacy. Ever. Understanding white privilege. Critical race theory, CRT, promotes the idea of white privilege. Most whites scoff at the notion that by virtue of our race that we have some kind of inborn privilege. But if you reply that you grew up in a lower middle class environment and had to work for everything in your life to get to where you are, it falls on deaf ears. White privilege is the notion that you live in a society whose institutions, culture, and history were forged by white people for the benefit of their posterity. Also, it is the notion that whites have passive advantages that you may not know about, which distinguishes white privilege from overt bias or prejudice. These include cultural affirmations of one's own worth, presumed greater social status, and freedom to move, buy, work, play, and speak freely. So, in Japan, do the Japanese have Japanese privilege? Do the Nigerians have Nigerian privilege in Nigeria? What about the Nicaraguans? Do Jews in Israel have Jewish privilege? You get the picture. Isn't it a good thing that people create a society in which they and their posterity will feel at home? Do you think the Japanese would have built up their culture, institutions, etc. just to hand it all over to Somalians? Of course not. Is it a crime that Japanese people get to enjoy the fruits of their ancestors' hard work and sacrifice? Of course not. So why should white people feel guilty about having white privilege? If non-whites don't feel at home in white societies, we do not have to accommodate them. They just have to go home. White guilt is what drives the white privilege narrative. Without it, it would go nowhere. The moment that whites drop the slave morality of checking their privilege and start embracing the master morality of taking their own side, then it falls apart. With that said, white privilege, which is really no privilege at all, but the basic right to feel at home somewhere on this planet, is great and we need more of it. White guilt. White guilt is a powerful force all throughout North America and Western Europe. Jewish-American Professor Paul Gottfried wrote a book about it, Multiculturalism and the Politics of Guilt, Towards a Secular Theocracy, in which he discusses how celebrations of diversity, multiculturalism, and white guilt are degrading our once dominant Western culture. Another term for white guilt is ethnomasochism, which Guillaume Fay describes as the masochistic tendency to blame and devalue one's ethnicity, one's own people. It is all part of a collective psychopathology, provoked by a concerted propaganda campaign to make Europeans feel guilty about how they've treated other peoples. It is part of an original sin of the European man's intrinsic racism and he must feel guilty for who he is. 2. White guilt manifests itself in a variety of ways. From transracial adoptions, to miscegenation, to excuses for why we must permit endless mass third world immigration, to pandering to Black Lives Matter, and to endless apologetics for being racist for taking our own side. When will whites finally be absolved of their original sin of racism? Likely never. Why the hate? To quote Finnish nationalist intellectual Kai Murros, without hate, one cannot possibly know love. Some people seem hateful because they are fueled by a passionate desire to protect what they love and cherish, their race, their culture, their homelands, and their way of life. The notion of loving everyone and hating hate is just a mindless leftist cliché. It is impossible to love everyone, and if you could, then your love would ultimately be meaningless. If you love everyone, then you love no one. Love is a very powerful emotion and should only be reserved for a limited amount of people, typically only people who would reciprocate those feelings. Since love is powerful, so is hate. Hate does not come from nowhere. Hate comes because we love. We hate those who try and harm the people and things we love. With that said, people do not typically hate those they do not know, have never met, and are not trying to destroy the things we love. For example, most people do not hate the people of New Guinea because they have never met any before. They aren't in our lands, they aren't assaulting our people, and they aren't destroying our way of life. It is only when we are made to live in close proximity to those unlike ourselves that we hate others. Harvard professor Robert Putnam wrote a whole book about this, Bowling Alone, where being close proximity to diversity makes us dislike and distrust our neighbors. It drains our communities of social capital. So yes, in the alt-right you will find those who are prejudiced towards others. However, I do not think their prejudices are entirely unwarranted. If you felt your way of life was being destroyed by another group of people, don't you think you'd be a tad bit prejudiced towards that group? Conclusion. There is a limited amount of space on this planet for all of the people in the world to exist. Africa is for Africans, Asia is for Asians, but white countries are for everyone. Only white countries are practicing multiculturalism, and there is no sign that other countries will adopt it. Since space is limited, when non-whites arrive in white countries, they have appropriated space that once belonged to us for our culture and our way of life. When they arrive, they begin dabbling in politics and reducing our political power in our homelands. Once demographics have shifted enough, eventually whites will not be able to exercise any political power or self-determination in deciding their destinies in our own homelands. This is why we do not have time for political correctness. This is why we do not care about being called racists. This is why you will see some people in the alt-right expressing prejudice. Our race, our culture, our traditions, our ways of life are being threatened with extinction. Mexico will always be Mexican. Japan will always be Japanese. But will white Americans have a place to call home? Will the English have a place to call home? How about the French? Based on current demographic trends, they won't. The alt-right aims to fix that.